Well, praise the Lord, everybody. This morning, we're going to begin our new series on God is our refuge. We're going to see how the Lord will be our refuge and bring strength and healing to those who are hurting and those that are overtaken with burdens. Our series is going to examine four different Psalms this time. Psalms 22, Psalms 34, Psalms 46, and Psalms 55. We must remember that no matter what we face in this life, we can be confident God will be near us and that He will help us carry our burdens that we have been tasked to bear. As we examine our strength and suffering today, we need to remember that when we cry out to God, we should trust Him in our suffering. Too often, we suffer and love to cry out, but who are we crying out to, and where is our trust? Hopefully today we'll realize we have a loving Savior that will be there for us, listen to us, and hold us in our suffering. Our focus verse today is found in Psalms 22, and we're going to read the first two scripture verses. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from helping me, and from the words of my roaring? O my God, I cry in the daytime, but thou hearest not, and in the night season, and am not silent. Many of us know what suffering is. Anyone who's lived any length of time that has a realization of life understands that there is suffering. According to Webster's, suffering is a state or experience of what one suffers. I find that odd, such a definition. Going to school, I was always taught don't ever define something by using some of the same words in its definition because it really doesn't explain. So I looked up the word suffer. When you suffer, you endure death, pain, or distress. You sustain a loss or a damage. You're subject to disability or handicap. Therefore, suffering is the state of experiencing a loss, a pain, a death, a distress, or a disability or handicap. All of us have suffered in some form or fashion. But what do we do with our suffering? How do we handle our suffering? Where do we even go from our suffering? Those of us that signify ourselves as Christians, we realize we have a guidebook called the Holy Writ. And oftentimes we look at it. There are examples of how to deal with our suffering found in it. And today we're going to look at two small stories of such people who've suffered. One from New Testament, one from Old. Imagine starting your day off full of a promise of God, looking forward to what God has given you and the opportunity to share the good news, knowing from your experience that you had spent 3 days blind, unable to see, struck down by God Himself, having a purpose going to Damascus, only to have it changed by the Lord. Your first words into this newfound faith is one by a man that simply calls you brother and lets you know that you have much to do. Your excitement as you receive your sight and the understanding that God was merciful to you. However, you do meet with some adversity. Those that you had persecuted, you are trying to convince to acknowledge, and so you find yourself spending an exiled time in Tarsus. But eventually your day comes, for a man known as Barnabas shows up at your doorstep to let you know that he needs your assistance. You're going to Antioch. You're going to hear about the joy that they received, and you're going to witness those that will first be called Christian. It is there that ultimately you're separated with your pal Barnabas and told that it's time to take this gospel further on. And so off you go with the nephew of Barnabas. You start off, the three of you, discussing what lies ahead, not knowing the way. And there, somewhere in the first few moments of hitting the new land, a disgruntled John Mark decides he's going home. He's had enough. This was not what he had bargained. But yet Barnabas is faithful, and on you go. You begin to preach and teach, and people receive your word. But there are fellow Jews, those that you once believed like, coming to destroy not only what you've taught, but everything you've started. So off you go, finding another city, and then another, until one day you arrive at the city known as Lystra. There you're going to teach and preach, and there's a crippled man there, and he had faith to believe what you were saying, how Jesus Christ came to seek and to save those that were lost, to perform the miracles, the signs and the wonders, and he's healed. The joy that goes across the people's face. But then there's a twist. They were so steeped in their traditions, they wanted to make you and your friend a god. They wanted to name your friend Jupiter and you Mercury, the messenger and the god. But you knew that there was only one Lord and one God. And so you try to make them understand. We find this recorded in Acts 14. In verse 18, it said, "And with these sayings scarce restrained they the people, that they had not done sacrifice unto them." You would think you would be rewarded. You would be patted. You would be at least honored for your humility. However, in verse 19, it said, "There came thither certain Jews from Antioch and Iconium who persuaded the people, and having stoned Paul, drew him out of the city, supposing he had been dead." Here you were on fire with a mission, with a mandate, trying to spread the gospel, letting people know that Jesus Christ had actually come, died for their sins, got buried, however, rose again, and that you had something more to offer them. And instead of being joyed, instead of receiving, you wind up getting stoned and left for dead. That would be enough to discourage most of us. How do we handle that? Here you start off with a fire in your bosom, ready to do that which God has called you, ready to teach, to preach, to show others that there's a better way, only to be stoned for it. What is your response to your suffering? Paul, we later learn, had a different example than one that we would expect. Paul stood up and came back into the city. Here's a man that just did good, stoned for that which he did. They could have pointed a finger at any one of his accusers, but he did nothing. He simply grabbed his friend and off they went to the next city, Derbe. Another example that we'll look at today is a well-known story, probably from one of the oldest books historically of the Bible. We don't know much about this man, other than he lived in the Ur of Chaldees. He may have actually been around when Abraham, known as Abram, was living. He was a wealthy man. He lived out in the desert area. He had much belongings. We simply know him as the man Job, an entire book written about his suffering. It says in Job 1, verses 6 through 11, There was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Satan answered and said, From going to and fro in the earth, from walking up and down in it. The Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? I would often pause right there in reading. It's easy to continue to the next verse. However, here's a man that knew nothing about God, save probably he was a descendant from Shem. He had heard about the God of his father Shem, knowing that he descended from Adam and Eve, having been kicked from a garden of luxury into a world, having listened to an alternative voice. Here was a man that didn't have the 10 Commandments, didn't have the rights of going before a Levi, didn't know what God was going to do in future days, but he feared the God that he had heard of. What is our excuse for not living right today? Those of us in 2022, Bibles at an easy access, oftentimes most households with 2 or 3, having tablets, having computer programs, having knowledge at our beck and fingertips. However, the story goes, the Lord said unto Satan, Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast not thou made a hedge about him and about his house and about all that he hath on every side, that thou bless the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land? But put forth thine hand now and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face. Once again, from a very beginning start, if one looks, why do we have such a fear of that one we call Satan? For even Satan himself could not touch this man without going to God first and asking for permission. We run around and wring our hands in fear of a devil that's already been cast out and defeated. We fear something that we don't understand, and we assume that the devil is on par with God. And yet here it is, Satan needing to beg from God permission before Job would be touched. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that hath is in thy power. Only upon him put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. Even if the devil does have permission to touch us, it's still within the constraints and the rules that God sets before him. So Job continues his righteous life. We don't know how many days hence or following the destruction came to Job. But it says in one day, in verses 14 through 17, there came a messenger unto Job and said, The oxen were plowing, the asses feeding beside them, and the Sabeans fell upon them and took them away. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. That in and of itself should break a man. Here he has much cattle, oxes, and donkeys, and he receives word that everything he had was destroyed, and the only remnant of memory is a servant. But yet, while he was speaking, there came also another. The fire of God has fallen from heaven and have burned up the sheep and upon the servants and consumed them, and only I escaped alone to tell thee. While he's still processing this knowledge of loss of ox and donkey, now his sheep are gone. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, The Chaldeans made out 3 bands and fell upon the camels and carried them away, and slain the servants with the edges of swords, and only I am escaped to tell thee. Back-to-back tragedy. Job wakes up one morning, rich, blessed, thinking the world is at his fingertips, to simply be told in quick concession every possession he owned was missing and gone, no longer his, and all he had were 3 simple servants to tell them and remind him of what he had. One would think that's enough to create despair and tragic. And yet, while this man was speaking, there came also another and said, thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead, and only I am escaped alone to tell thee. Tragedy didn't just strike Job once or even thrice, but for 4 times in one small period of time, Job heard that he no longer had possessions. He didn't even have his family to comfort him now. One would wonder how you deal with such tragedy, such suffering. In 20 and 22, it's easy to tell those that suffer tragedy, for those are the ones that will tell you about it. Those are the ones that will seek solace in alcohol, drugs. They're the ones that go to tell our psychiatrists that they can't handle life and need something to walk through this life with. Never thinking that there's a God up above. But yet Job, it says in verse 20, arose, he rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down to the ground and worshipped. And in verse 22, it concludes, in all this, Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. It's easy to be on the mountaintop and praise when the world's at our fingertips, when we have good jobs, our health is at its best, our storehouses are full, our refrigerators bursting at the seam, our gas in the car. It just seems everything is sunshine and rainbows. But how do we behave when we find ourselves in a valley? When we find out that there's no food in the pantry, that we've just lost the job that was paying all our bills, or worse yet, when we lose our loved ones. Do we act as Job? His pain, his grief was sincere. He rent his mantle. He shaved his head. He knew grief, and he was demonstrating it. But he did not charge God foolishly or curse God in any way. Such calamity to one man, and you would think the story ends. But we'd only gotten into the first chapter. Chapter 2 starts no better than the first. For again there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan came also amongst them to present himself. And the Lord said unto Satan, from whence comest thou? Satan answered the Lord, from going to and fro in the earth, from walking upon and up and down it. And the Lord said unto Satan, hast thou considered my servant Job? There is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil. And still he holdeth fast his integrity, although thou movest against me to destroy him without cause. And Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin, yea, all that a man hath will he give for his life. But put forth thy hand now, and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse thee to thy face. And the Lord said to Satan, Behold, he's in thy hand, but save his life. Once again, the devil tried to bargain with God. He took away his possessions. He took away his family. And yet, Job maintained his integrity. When we suffer, we too should maintain our integrity with God, not charging him foolishly. Job didn't know what tomorrow would bring. There was no promise even there would be a tomorrow. And yet he worshiped. And then Job learned another lesson. For the next day when he arose, there appeared boils and scabs. And now even his flesh was deteriorating. Job was now being persecuted bodily. He still had breath in his lungs, blood through his veins, but outwardly was a massive sore. It does say that Job cried out to God. In chapter 3, we read, he cries, Let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said, There is a man-child conceived. For the thing which I greatly feared is come upon me, and that which I was afraid of is come unto me. I was not in safety, neither had I rest, neither was I quiet, yet trouble came. Job's handling of the situation is unique. He suffered, he cried out, but he looked to God in his suffering. And we too can look to God in our suffering. The psalmist David, a man known after God's own heart, knew many victories and many defeats. He knew great joy as well as great sorrow, some at his own hand, of his own choice, some that he had nothing to do with. He knew what it was like to listen to his father sitting out on a hillside watching sheep, honoring his father to go forth to a battle to feed his brothers, only to be called a mischievous and a naughty boy. He knew what it was like to suffer humiliation, loneliness, and despair. And in his times, he was able to pen, crying out to God and having God answer him. For in Psalms 50 and 15, it's penned, And call upon me in the day of trouble. I will deliver thee, and thou shalt glorify me. God had given David a key to going through the trouble. In time of trouble, call unto him. Let him know. He already knows. He already sees. He already knows the beginning from the end. But yet, go to him in faith, trusting him in your trouble. And then he promised that he would deliver him. Unfortunately, too often we stop right there. We get ourselves in trouble, either from our own choice or from others' choices. When we have no gas in the car, no food on the table, or we find ourselves in a war, a foxhole, where life hangs in the balance, it's easy to call on God, declare him the victor, ask for his deliverance, but then go on and forget But the rest of that verse says that we should glorify God. Once he's come through and delivered as he promised, then we need to turn around and acknowledge him for his help. Anytime we are tested, we must remember, not sometimes they are unexpected. Paul did not wake up with the thought that when I get to Lystra, there I'm going to be stoned. There they're going to try and make gods of me and Barnabas. Job did not look out the morning that he stepped out of his tent, look under the hills and say, today I'm going to receive word that I'm losing my sheep, my oxen, my donkeys, and ultimately my children. Oftentimes our tests come when we least expect, but how we handle them will determine all the difference. It's natural to feel forsaken, for we see in Psalms 22, at the very start, David penned, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why art thou so far from me, helping me, and from the words of my roaring? It's natural to feel even our prayers sometimes are not answered. For in verse 2, O my God, I cry in the daytime, but thou hearest not, in the night season, and am not silent. And if we're not careful, we end there. We throw our hands up in despair. We decide God has forsaken us. Our prayers are not answered when we think they ought to, and it's time to move on. But if we would continue on, we realize that God will give us strength to those who turn to him in their suffering. For in verse 3, thou art holy, O thou that inhabitest the praise of Israel. He reminded himself that our fathers trusted in thee. They trusted, and thou didst deliver them. They cried unto thee, and were delivered. They trusted in thee, and were not confounded. One only has to look at God's dealing with the children of Israel in the Old Testament to understand he did not tolerate their sin. He did not put up with their arrogance and their rebellion. But he was a loving God that if they would turn to him and commit to him their ways and their wanderings, he would lead them and guide them. He led them from Egypt into the promised land. A cloud by day so that they could see where to go. A pillar of fire by night to give them light and knowledge that he was still with them. He gave them leaders through Moses, Joshua, and even when they forsook him and went their own way, brought them judges, letting them know that he was still there as a faithful shepherd, guiding and leading. In the same Psalm 22, verse 9 and 10, but thou art he that took me out of the womb. Thou dost make me hope when I was upon my mother's breast. I was cast upon thee from the womb. Thou art my God from my mother's belly. David understood the God that he served, that from the very beginning, before he even had the conscious knowledge of good and evil, while he was yet a baby, it was God that was with him and that God would guide him. We like to talk about our government and the assistance it will give us from cradle to grave, but how many of us turn to our God and realize that it is he that is with us from the womb to the tomb. He will not leave or forsake us from our very secret making in the womb, all the way until we breathe our last and lay down in that tomb that is appointed for us. He reminded himself in 19 through 22, be thou not, But be thou far from me, O Lord. O my strength hast thee to help me. Deliver my soul from the sword, my darling from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth, for thou hast heard me from the horn of the unicorns. We should encourage ourselves in our suffering. If God could be with us on the mountaintop, surely, as the psalmist penned, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, he is with me. He will be with us to lead us and guide us, to prepare that table before our enemies, and to bless us. In Deuteronomy 31:6, it says, be strong and of a good courage. Fear not, nor be afraid of them. For the Lord thy God, he it is that doth go with thee. He will not fail nor forsake thee. We must understand our strength comes from the Lord. And as we go forth this week, when we're suffering, let us go back and review Psalms 22. It concludes with, I will declare thy name unto my brethren. In the midst of the congregation will I praise thee. Yes, we'll go through suffering. Every person experiences it, knows it. But with God being on our side, we can come through it. How we handle it will determine how we handle it. And remember, as Paul wrote to Rome, we know that all things work together for them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. Suffering is natural and normal. It will come to each and every one of us. Let us find comfort in our suffering so that we too could go to those and comfort those around us, and to let them know that they do not have to suffer alone. Let's remember to come back at 10:15, where we will once again hear live what God has for us this glorious and wonderful day.